Hello, I want to welcome you to our Coffee and Conversation group. My name is Sarah Carell, the founder of The Power of Our Story. We are a community where veterans, first responders, and all protectors can connect, share their experiences, and heal together. So today I want to welcome our guest, Katherine Boyle. She is somebody that we love on The Power of Our Story. A little bit about Katherine. She grew up in a law enforcement family with her father serving as lieutenant of the Special Victims Unit for the Philadelphia Police Department. As a child, she didn't fully understand the weight of his job, but over time, she saw its impact on her family and realized how hard he worked to excel at his career while staying present for them. The 2020 riots deepened Catherine's understanding of the challenges officers face, particularly the emotional toll on their families. She recognized a common disconnect between law enforcement officers and their children. Catherine's mission is to raise awareness of how the job affects officers' children, advocate for their well-being, and help officers build stronger relationships with their families that last long after retirement. She also has a podcast called Beyond the Uniform with the LT's daughter. So, with all that being said, Katherine, I warmly welcome you to the Power of Our Story, and I'm going to hand it over to you to share your story. Thanks so much for being on.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. I feel so excited to speak with you all, and yeah, I just feel honored that you're all here. And many of you have been on the podcast Beyond the Uniform with the LT's daughter, which is extra cool. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen because I do have a presentation. I'm going to go through it a little bit on the fast side just because I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time at the end for discussion because I know that everybody here loves that part of these calls, and I think that that's really where the magic happens. But first, let's dive in. Okay, can you guys see? Are we good? Okay, perfect. You guys? Okay, so just to start, Sarah already mentioned my mission is to essentially help law enforcement officers prioritize family and connection by sharing experiences, encouraging open conversations, and most importantly, understanding the impact of the job on themselves and, of course, their families, but especially their children. I do that through, of course, my podcast, Beyond the Uniform with the LT's daughter, speaking, trainings, events, and I recently came out with a workbook, a connection workbook for families. A lot of you guys, I think, know some of these statistics, but I'm going to share them anyway because they're very jarring. Police officers are exposed to about 178 critical incidents in a career. A recent study showed that it can be anywhere up to 400 critical incidents, and that's compared to the average citizen's 2 to 3 in an entire lifetime. This next one is the most jarring to me, always has been, always will be, but the average law enforcement officer lives about 6 years beyond retirement, which is horrible in general, but especially horrible when you take into consideration how young people get into this job and how young they get out of this job. Which brings us to our next statistic, which is the life expectancy of a police officer is 66 years old compared to the average citizen, which is 78 years old. Police officers are 30 to 70 times more likely to die from sudden cardiac arrest. And then finally, I think you all know this statistic, but cops die by suicide, more by suicide than they do in the line of duty. And then these are just some of the recent statistics as far as the suicide numbers go. And I use this slide in all of my presentations, and it's gut-wrenching how often I have to update 2025s. I just did a presentation 2 weeks ago, and I had to add 5 suicides to that last number. Okay, so more about me. I'm the LT's daughter. I grew up in Philadelphia. My dad was lieutenant of Special Victims Unit for most of my life, most of my memory, but he was a Philadelphia police officer for almost 30 years. All of my uncles and, of course, a lot of my cousins are also Philadelphia police officers or retired. In 1991, my cousin Danny was killed in the line of duty at the age of 21 during a traffic stop. And I share all of that to just kind of give you all an overview and an insight into how much this job has kind of had an impact on my life. Because as I'll get into, I didn't actually understand that this job had any effect on my life or who I am to this day. But a little bit more recently, of course, I'm the host of Beyond the Uniform with the LT's Daughter. I have been a guest on over 30 law enforcement focused podcasts. As the adult child of a police officer, I think I'm the only one out there that really speaks on my experience. And so I've had quite a few podcasts reach out to me to share. I am a speaker and an advocate for other law enforcement children. And of course, I'm the founder of Beyond the Uniform. A little bit of background on my dad. So obviously the LT is short for lieutenant. His name is also Mike Boyle. He is retired lieutenant of Philadelphia Special Victims Unit, which is the fourth largest police department in the United States. And in that department, he's held in a very, very high regard. He has worked very high profile cases that have made not only the national news, but also the international news. He's had cases that were made into documentaries, one that was made into a Lifetime movie. He's always been a victim's advocate, maybe first and foremost. He's also always been a mentor to the people who worked for him. He even, one of the detectives who used to work for him, he walked her down the aisle and gave her away at her wedding. And I shared recently with some of you guys a couple weeks ago, during promotions, he had someone who worked for him. When they got promoted to sergeant, they requested to have his sergeant's badge number, which in this world is kind of an honor. He also, when he retired, he started the PSARC, which is the Philadelphia Sexual Assault Response Center. So as someone working in Special Victims Unit, he saw a need for victims to have a safe place to go to get their rape kits done, because as it was, they were being taken to the emergency room. And especially in downtown Philadelphia, they were sitting next to people with broken limbs, people that were overdosing on drugs and doing and experiencing all sorts of things, and they were just being re-traumatized all over again. So he started the what is called the PSARC so that they would have a safe place to go for that very sensitive time. Um, Above everything, he left a really big impact on the Philadelphia Police Department and the people who worked with him and for him. But what I remember, and what maybe my brother remembers, is that he was always the greatest dad. He was always there. He was always present. He always showed up for us. He was a supportive husband, and he was a dedicated son. And in my opinion, it's everything that I just mentioned with an emphasis on the dad, husband, and son piece that make up his entire legacy and inspire my personal mission. So a little bit about how all of this came to be. Again, Sarah sort of mentioned this in my intro, but during 2020, I was living in New York City. My background is in fashion. I spent most of my adult life living in New York City. And during that time, I had a lot of former friends who were participating in the riots, and they were reaching out to me personally, and they were challenging me and questioning me and expecting me to speak on behalf of every police officer everywhere. Um, and that combined with the fact that my social media was obviously inundated with all kinds of nonsense about the riots. Also, it was a really kind of a tough time. And for me, I couldn't understand that they couldn't see the human that was standing in front of them. They could not separate that uniform from the human, and what they had sort of decided that person in front of them represented was the end all be all, and therefore they were the enemy, regardless of who that person actually was. And I couldn't understand that because to me, when I see these people, and I've always thought of it this way, they were someone's father or uncle because that's how I know them as. And so during that time, I was having kind of trouble sleeping. It was a really rough time. And one night I just had this thought bubble in my head that I had to do something to support law enforcement. I needed them to know that I was a civilian who had their backs. And so I started Googling. I got a bunch of nonprofits, but again, I really wanted to be boots on the ground with them and be an advocate for them. And so I needed to figure out what that looked like. These are pictures from an event that I hosted at a local gym. My brother's actual good friend owns this gym, so he helped me put together this workout to just kind of show up and show support for law enforcement. All the proceeds were donated to a scholarship that was opened by my uncle in my cousin's memory. Um, but it still wasn't quite what I wanted. So I decided to start having sort of for informational interviews with law enforcement so that I could find out from the horse's mouth, so to speak, how I could actually support them and what that could look like. But what I didn't expect was I would sit down with these men at the time, and I would obviously give a brief introduction of who I am and why I give a crap. And it was really short, it was really brief, but it was really impactful for the officer on the other side of the screen because they were having these real-time realizations that they were missing out on something. And almost every time they said back to me, my kids would never talk about me the way you talk about your dad. And I wasn't singing his praises necessarily. I was just giving them a little bit of background information, I thought. Um, but that kept coming up over and over again. And there was a common theme that they were waiting for retirement before wanting to have a relationship with their kids, or they didn't know what was going on at home because their spouse handled everything at home. Their job was to provide, and they were missing out on all these little nuances about their own kids' lives. They were more focused on their name and legacy as a cop and who they could be in and on the force than who the impact that they were going to be leaving on their own family and the people that they brought into the world. They were also more comfortable at work than at home. They didn't know how to sort of make that transition. Nobody taught them how to make that transition. So at the end of the day, they just kind of found themselves avoiding going home altogether. Um, and a lot of them found themselves making up for lost time. So some of them were actually already retired, and they were telling me that post retirement or as they came up on retirement, they were realizing that they were trying to fit in a whole lot of time with their kids that their kids didn't necessarily want to do because their kids didn't necessarily know who they were, or they didn't feel a connection to them because they hadn't put in any work with them when they were little. So now that they're getting older, they didn't necessarily have any interest. Combine that with the fact that some of them were teenagers or young adults. They had their own lives that they wanted to live, and they didn't have time for their parent because their parent suddenly decided that they wanted to be involved. And for this one, it's actually interesting. This one came up a lot, and I think some of you might know Dr. Erin Craw. She works with police officers. Her dad was a police officer, and she experienced something similar to this. She had a great father. She had a great relationship with him, except that he was very unpredictable, and she never knew which version of him was going to walk through the door. So was it whether it was going to be the dad she knew and loved, the dad who got mad at the drop of a hat, or the dad who completely ignored her and acted like she didn't exist. Um, but this one is also a special, and I'm going to talk about her a little bit more on the next slide, so I'm not going to get too into the weeds with her story, but also this one, my husband and I are rewatching Family Matters. And as you all probably know, maybe know, Carl is a police officer. And there's a whole episode around this topic. And in it, he's trying to bond with Eddie, who is like 17. And he's trying desperately to connect with him. And Eddie wants nothing to do with it. and Carl almost dies, so to speak, and there's chaos and all of the things. And at the end of the episode, Carl tells Eddie that he spent his Eddie's entire childhood working too much, and now he's trying to make up for lost time. And Eddie was like, "I'm 17. I want to go out with girls. This isn't what I have time for right now." And obviously, it's Family Matters, so they all kind of worked it out. But the fact that even a show like Family Matters addressed this as an issue, I thought was really interesting. Um, and then finally, some of them were reflecting that they had wished that they had done something differently because now they felt like too much time had passed and the damage was already done. So when it comes to the kids, and I think some of you on this call might understand, when it comes to the spouses, they can sort of speak up for themselves. They can communicate their frustrations. It might not be productive communication, but as another adult in the home, they can communicate and they can say, "You're taking on too much overtime. You're not acting like yourself. You're drinking too much," whatever it could be. They can actually vocalize that. But kids can't slash don't because they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the awareness, they don't have the maturity, they don't know what they don't know. So as kids, they're just kind of accepting what's given to them. And then we don't recognize until they're older, until they can vocalize that something was wrong, something was amiss. They go to therapy, they cut you off, whatever it is, and the damage is already done at that point. So again, circling back to Erin, who I mentioned on the last slide, she didn't know which version of her dad was going to walk through the door. As an 8-year-old child, having her parent straight up ignore her was traumatizing in and of itself. And she would try to make that make sense. In her 8-year-old brain, she didn't know, maybe I should ask someone. She would just make up her own kind of resolutions, her own answers, and she would come to her own conclusion that it was her fault in some capacity. She didn't play well at her softball game, whatever it is. She blamed herself and assumed that it must be her fault that her dad was not speaking to her. And, you know, fast forward, she gets a little bit older and he shifts his he gets put on a different shift and he has more time to spend with her and now he kind of wants to, you know, lay down the law or implement different rules, and she's a teenager, and now that's causing a whole different sort of element within their relationship. Erin was a guest on my podcast. She was episode 16. We talk about everything that I just sort of summarized. I highly recommend you listen to that episode because her story is, it could be anyone's story. So it's really impactful. But again, at the end of the day, I really want to build awareness and advocate for these kids and their experiences because they're not going to do it for themselves. And then finally, just something that I've realized as civilians, and I want to caveat this slide. You all know me, you all know who my husband is, you all know that I love and appreciate everything our military and our veterans have done and sacrificed. So this is not a slight on them in any capacity, but it is something that needs addressed because as civilians, we are not recognizing the sacrifices that law enforcement make. And again, civilians, these two pictures are a perfect example. The picture on the left is my husband in Afghanistan behind walls made of mud that he and his comrades built with their own two hands. That is the only thing protecting them from actual warfare in another country in the desert. We cannot, as civilians especially, we cannot conceptualize what that even means. It just doesn't compute because it's another country, it's another way of life, and we can only imagine what happens when someone goes to war. On the flip side, police officers go to war, so to speak, in their own backyards. They could be arresting their own child's best friend's parent or responding to their babysitter's domestic abuse call. I mean, they're doing not similar things, but equally horrific things in their own backyards, and civilians don't recognize it. And this was actually solidified on Wednesday. I had jury duty, and the woman that I was speaking to I told her what I do, and she was like, wow, I never thought that cops had to deal with anything that intense. And she brought up military, and she was like, I know our military, they go overseas and I don't even know what they do. I don't even want to think about what they're experienced or exposed to, but I never thought about what cops do on a day-to-day basis. And it's so true. And again, that this doesn't mean that the veterans get the respect that they deserve or the help that they deserve, but when it comes to civilians especially, we have an understanding that our veterans and our military are experiencing unspeakable things, and we don't recognize that same element in what our first responders in general, but again, for the sake of this conversation, what our police officers are experiencing. This is a quick framework that I walk people through in my trainings. I'm not going to go through it right now, but I do want to tell you how I came up with it. My dad was 31 when he became a police officer. He had a 4-year college degree in psychology. His goal was to go into the psych field. During that time in the 70s, the psych field was ceasing to exist, essentially, and he got laid off. So he needed a job. His brother was a cop. They had good benefits, good pay, good job. He became a cop. And I think that that had a really big role in how he was sort of able to do all the things and balance everything the way he did, because he went into it with a very different perspective, and he went into it with life experience under his belt, education under his belt. And as it stands, police officers are getting into the field at 21, sometimes even 19 years old. And obviously, not everybody can become a cop at 31 years old. But what I did to come up with this framework was sort of laid out everything that it meant to become for him to become a cop at 31. Again, the years of life experience, the education that he had, the mindset that he had, the values that he had already instilled in his own life and that he knew he wanted to instill in his kids. And I sort of reverse engineered it, and I came up with this framework that I offer police officers when I do trainings. And then just some final thoughts that I'm going to go through fairly quickly because again, I want to make sure that we have time for discussion or Q&A or what have you. But law enforcement officers obviously experience a lot and they always see people at their worst 9 times out of 10. And because of this, their brain chemistry literally changes. And I think it's very, very important to emphasize that point because it's easy to chalk it up to man up, move on, whatever it is. But over time, their brain chemistry can actually change and will look different than someone like my own. Um, these are human beings, and they are becoming they are the face of the entire justice system for civilians. And this is becoming worse and worse as true crime podcasts and true crime TV shows get more and more popular because people don't understand how the just sorry about this. People don't understand how the justice system works, and so they just put everything on the cops. And they don't understand the nuances and the intricacies of what happens after someone is arrested and the steps that things have to take between arrest and conviction or even after that. And I think that this is a huge problem that is being made worse with the rise of true crime. The nature of the job, again, obviously the trauma and the critical incidents, but aside from that, the physicality. So you could go from not having a call for weeks on end to having a really intense foot chase. You could, if you're in a more senior position, you might be at your desk all the time. The equipment, the weight of the vest, the belt, you have to actually adjust how you sit or stand to accommodate these things. The long hours, the late nights, the food even that's available to police officers on these overnight shifts, especially, these all have long-term physical and mental impact on our police officers. And again, these things especially are overlooked a lot. Of course, the way they cope historically does not help. So Again, the drinking, the thrill seeking, um, sex, these things become coping mechanisms, and it does not help. It obviously perpetuates the problem. A lot of times they'll think that if there are no glaring issues, then there are no issues. So they might compare themselves to someone else on the squad who has a lot of marital issues or who is drinking way more than they ever could or would. And they might assume that because they're not that, quote, bad off, then they must be fine. And they make excuses for themselves in that right. This might not be a right now problem, again, especially for people who are 21, 22, 25 years old and they don't have families yet. But it's really important to be proactive and plan for the future because inevitably, if someone is getting into this job at 22 years old and they start implementing some bad habits or some not necessarily bad habits, but less than great habits, and they eventually want to bring a family into the mix, it can be really tough for everyone involved to sort of undo some of those negative learned behaviors that were established before their brain was even fully developed. I always emphasize being a proactive participant in their lives and in the lives of their loved ones, to not sort of let life pass them by, not make excuses for themselves, not assume that everything is good to go just because, their spouse takes care of everything. Of course, their families are also subject to these repercussions. And I mean this even as like the most minimal example possible, like just because there's not necessarily a drinking problem or um, something really serious going on, your family is still impacted by this. And a good example that I can give is that it is not normal for a child to watch their parent put a gun on their hip every single day. And that becomes normal in our way of life, but it's not normal. And it's something that needs to be addressed because it does have an impact on that would have an impact on any child. Um, this is a generational job, so everything can become a cycle. So it's very important to break some of those generational traits. The general public doesn't know or think about this stuff, which again, I didn't realize. I had no idea. It was very jarring. I felt very silly when I was slapped in the face with all of that 2020 stuff because to be quite honest, I didn't even know the word pig was a thing. I didn't know what ACAB meant. I didn't know any of that. I was blindsided back in 2020. Um, and then again, these are human beings performing a very inhuman job, a job that no human being was ever, ever, ever designed to do. And we expect them to do it flawlessly all the time without proper help or support. And again, it's easy to forget that they are human beings because they are perceived as robots. They become the face of all of the things. Again, their children are exposed to more than most. The gun example is a great example of that. Another one is telling your parent to be careful when he or she goes to work. Again, not normal. And then finally, just generally speaking, I think we just need more empathy across the board as human beings. We need a reminder that everybody has their own human experience, and we need to offer that empathy for one another. And then finally, this is my contact information. I think a lot of you know where to find me, but if anyone wants to contact me, listen to the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Catherine, that was so powerful. That we need your voice. We need your voice. We need this angle. It's not talked about a lot. There really is something so new and powerful about hearing the daughter's voice, and it's just gold. So I want to thank you. Before we have a group discussion, can you put on that first slide again that has the statistics and
Oh,
then
yeah.
okay, that would be great. Just give people a minute to look at that. That is That's powerful.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, and I just want to share too. I share this a lot, but as a civilian, I do have a son who is serving now. But again, it was a veteran's sharing his story with me that opened up my whole world of, I think as civilians, like you said, we see military, we see first responders as kind of superhuman, and there's a disconnect. But when he shared his story with me, I mean, that's why I'm doing everything that I'm doing right now to build that bridge, to have your voices come out and to share the importance that we need to protect our protectors. So, Catherine, again, I cannot thank you enough. So do you have any last words before we shut off the recording?
Just to piggyback off of what you just mentioned, another thing, and the woman at jury duty echoed this exactly. Another thing with law enforcement and first responders that people sort of take for granted, I guess, they go home at the end of a shift. So they, it's perceived that they almost perceive that they have a 9 to 5 job. And because they get to go home, they're fine. They have it just fine. But really, that's almost not a good thing because they don't have any decompression time, they don't have any downtime, and they usually, more often than not, don't have any tools to actually transition immediately back into home life. And that can be a really jarring transition to make in the same 24-hour cycle.
Yeah. There's so much to talk about, isn't there?
Yeah.
To
Yeah,
protect
that's
our
why I wanted to make
protectors.
sure we had some time.
Yes. So I want to thank everybody who has taken the time to watch this video and to also invite you on to the power of our story to be part of our tribe, to be part of the discussion, to be part of the solution. So again, Catherine, that was gold. Thank you so much. In the description, I'll have all the contact information and Catherine's bio. So thanks so much.